Okay, time to begin on Chapter 8. This is the chapter entitled Basic Biomechanics. And again, biomechanics, structure and function of the biological systems. We are continuing on learning about motion and kinetics in the body. Basically, this chapter wraps around a lot of concepts when it comes to the effect of gravity and our body and the mass of our body, some laws of inertia, motion, so on and so forth. So let's get started. Kinesiology again combines anatomy, biomechanics, and physiology for understanding human movement. The human body is a living machine. When studying how the body moves, we have to learn and understand the forces that cause our body to move. We can have internal forces, such as our muscles, our skeletal system, and we can have external forces, such as gravity or wind or someone else pushing us. Some mechanical terms that you are going to need to get acquainted with. I've listed out mechanics, biomechanics, static, dynamic, mass, inertia, friction, osteokinematics, and arthrokinematics. So the difference here is osteokinematics, we discuss how bones move in space, and arthrokinematics, how joint surfaces will move in relationship to each other. More terminology that you're going to have to get acquainted with that we will discuss as we move into this chapter. Force, vector, scalar, torque, velocity, and acceleration. Okay, so getting into our first section here, we are going to discuss Isaac Newton's 3 laws of motion. We have to take a trip back to physics class, if anyone had physics. We're going to discuss the law of inertia, the law of acceleration, and the law of action-reaction. I posted down at the bottom just another quick little video. Actually, it's not very quick, but it's a great explanation with some animation, visual aids to help you get acquainted with these 3 different laws. They don't necessarily go right into explaining from the physical therapy perspective, but it does give you a good idea of what these laws mean, and then what we will do as your instructors is explain these a little better from the physical therapy perspective. So first law, law of inertia. An object at rest tends to stay at rest, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion. Inertia is the tendency of an object to stay at rest or in motion. That's the definition. So when we talk about this particular law, we might give the example, and I think your book gives the same example, of riding in a car. If you don't have your seatbelt on and your car is in motion, when the car stops by an outside force, such as a brick wall, your body continues on, okay? When it comes to the first law of inertia, we say object at rest stays at rest, or it tends to, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion. So if we are in that same car and we are driving along and we, as the force, slow the car down, our body stops with the car. Okay? But if for some reason an outside force, or if we have to slam on our brakes quickly, our bodies will keep going. Okay? When an object is in motion, its resistance wants to stay in motion, and when in rest, it wants to stay in rest. And all of this is dependent upon, unless it is acted upon by that outside force. So the second law of motion, the law of acceleration. The amount of acceleration depends on the strength of the force applied to an object. It can also mean a change in direction, or acceleration is inversely proportional to the mass of an object. So an example of that would be if you have a soccer ball and a bowling ball, and you apply the same force to both. You throw them both. The soccer ball is going to go farther because it has less mass. Another example of that might be if you have that soccer ball and you kick it as hard as you can. Think about how far that's going to go. If you have a soccer ball next to it and you tap that one with not as much force, how far is that going to go? So these laws of acceleration, of course, depend on the strength of the force applied to the object, and then, of course, the object itself, the mass. So Newton's third law, the law of action-reaction. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The reaction is always equal in strength to the action, and the reaction occurs in the opposite direction. So think about if you have ever jumped on a trampoline. The harder you jump down, the trampoline is going to push back with that same amount of force up. And so, I can visualize kiddos out on the trampoline and they're jumping, and when you first get acquainted with the trampoline, you aren't going to jump very high, and so the trampoline doesn't give you back more force. It gives you the same amount of force that you give it. As you get used to the trampoline and you start jumping down harder, the trampoline is going to push back with that same amount of force and make you go up higher. How about sitting in a chair? Seems kind of like a strange analogy, but if you stop and think about it, you sit down in the chair and that chair is holding you up. So whatever force you give that chair, it's going to push back the same way. Another example might be the kick of a gun when it fires a bullet forward. So it's funny, I watched a show not too long ago, and a gentleman was teaching his wife, they live in Alaska, he was teaching her how to use her new gun, and it was a shotgun, and she actually held the gun up at pretty close range to her face because there was a scope on it, and she's looking through the scope, and she fired the gun. And what she didn't realize, and what her husband failed to tell her, was that there is a force from that gun that creates a kickback. Okay, and so when you're firing outward and applying that kind of force outward, it's the gun actually reacted and kicked back in the opposite direction, and the back end, or the blunt end of the gun, hit her in the face and gave her a really terrible black eye. So law of action reaction right there. Motion cannot occur without a force. So there's two types of forces that can cause body motion, and we've got internal and external forces here, what we kind of discussed right at the beginning. Internal forces can include muscle contractions, ligament restraint, or bony support in the body. These are internal forces. External forces include the effect of gravity. If you have weights or some sort of friction that keeps you from motion or that creates more motion. When it comes to physical therapy, both the PTs and PTAs must be able to use their knowledge of forces, both internal and external, whenever it comes to patient treatment. In other words, if you were having a patient perform an activity such as getting up out of the chair, we have to understand that they are having to fight against an external force to get up out of that chair, which is what? Gravity. Knowledge and understanding of the forces that act on a person's body, internal and external, allow us to determine how muscles are working, how to strengthen those muscles, and how to help a patient perform activities that they need to perform. If we are rehabilitating a patient's shoulder and we find that their exercises are way too easy, we might want to apply an external force to make it a little bit harder to really promote strengthening in that shoulder. So I may give them a hand weight to hold on to. Knowledge and understanding of forces is a critical aspect to provide quality care by both PTs and PTAs. Force is any push or pull, action, or influence that moves or deforms an object. And we have what's called a vector quantity here. A vector describes both the magnitude and the direction. So there's some different forces that we're going to talk about real fast: linear, parallel, concurrent, and resultant. So I'm going to go on and we're going to discuss. So linear force is when two or more forces are acting along the same line. So as you can tell, you've got two men and they're trying to pull a boat into or onto the shore. So their force is pulling along that same line. They're pulling in one direction. Now the second example here is two people that are pushing from opposite directions. I don't love this picture. I actually think about if you have an extra leaf in a table and you take that leaf out and you want to close the table in, you've got to have forces acting on the same line, but they're acting in opposite directions here. Parallel force, the force that occurs in the same plane, in the same or opposite direction. So this is not on the same line, as you can tell, but it is in the same plane. In this case, this is called a Jewett brace, and it is keeping this patient upright and stable, keeping them from creating unwanted motion, probably after a back surgery or maybe prior to a back surgery because of an injury. So you've got forces that are acting opposite directions towards each other, but in the same plane. And then concurrent force, this is when two or more forces act from a common point but are pulling in different directions. The result of this is called the resultant force. So here you've got the task of pulling this large box, and they need to get it where the arrow is pointing. As you can tell right here, they need to get it, let's say, over here. So they're pulling from two different directions, or in two different directions, to get this to move in another direction, which is that resultant force, where it ends up. And of course, the net effect of two divergent forces is the resultant force. A great example in the human body of a resultant force is the anterior and posterior deltoid muscles of the shoulder. So if you stop and think about the shoulder and go ahead and get into the fundamental position where your palms are facing the side of your body, and you raise your arms out to the side, all right? What's happening here is you are using your anterior and posterior deltoids. You're working both of them. They're pulling in different directions, okay? However, the resultant force is going to be you raising your arm out to your side, and that's the end result here. Okay. Other types of force that we're talking about, that we're going to talk about, go along with these. Right here, you've got a force happening, the pushing along the same line, and again the same thing. And then here you've got opposite directions. You can also use these pictures to talk about what's called compression or approximation. It's when two areas will compress or push against each other. And then you've got traction or distraction, and that's when two objects are pulling away from each other. And then you've got what's called a shear force, and that's if you think about if you're trying to warm up your hands and you put your hands together and you move them in opposite directions to create heat, you're creating that friction, and so that's a type of force also. A force couple occurs when two forces act in an equal but opposite direction, and you're trying to get here again a particular result, and the result here is a turning effect. So an example would be unscrewing a jar lid. Force A is the fingers right here, and then force B is the thumb, and you'll notice the fingers are moving one direction, the thumb is moving the other direction. And we use this skill every day. And here you go again. You've got a little merry-go-round, and you've got a child pushing one direction, another child pushing the other, but the resultant force is that rotation. So if you were to look at the human body, and again, you don't have to learn the muscles yet, this is just a good example. You've got the upper trapezius working in one direction because of the line of pull. You've got the serratus anterior working in another direction. And then, of course, the lower trapezius pulling down, working in another direction. Well, what does this create? What motion? It's the motion we just talked about, which is raising your arm up into a different position. And so when all of these forces are moving in different directions, they're still creating one particular movement. Torque is the moment of force, basically the ability of force to produce rotation about an axis is your rotary force here. Amount of torque that a lever has, it depends on the amount of force it's exerted and perpendicular distance from the axis to the moment arm. Keep in mind, or just remember that torque equals force, or torque is that basically that power that we have. The book talks about torque or a twist force exerted by a wrench, by one, increasing the force applied to the handle of the wrench, and then another is increasing that length of the handle. In the case of a muscle, torque is greatest when the angle of pull is at 90 degrees. So we can use this example. Let's take a bicep muscle. So if you bend your elbow and you bend it to 90 degrees, or that right angle, that's when you will have the greatest torque here, or the greatest power. And I believe that's on, I think it's figure 8-10 in your book, I believe. And you know what you can do, what you all can do as students, and if you are in a classroom setting, you'll probably look at this in class, or you can do this at home. Use that wrench as the example of torque and twisting, and stop and think about when you put the wrench up against the bolt and you are trying to loosen it. We don't grip up close to the bolt on the wrench. We actually grip further away to increase that length of the handle, and it helps us and gives us more torque to loosen or tighten. Again, the amount of torque that a lever has depends on the amount of force exerted and the distance from the axis. We can increase torque by increasing the force applied and increasing the distance from the axis. So here's that activity that you might want to try at home, or we can try it in the classroom if you are in the classroom setting. Find something that you would use a wrench on, or screwdriver even, to loosen. Hold the wrench or screwdriver close to the object if you're trying to turn it. And then now, this time, hold the wrench or screwdriver at the end of the wrench or screwdriver. And which one's easier? Which of your hand positions on the wrench or screwdriver made it easier to turn the object? Let's look at a human anatomy example. That may be something like if we are sitting and we want to keep a patient, or we want to test their muscle strength, and we want to keep a patient from straightening their knee. So if they're in the sitting position, their knees are bent, and we don't want them to kick their foot out. We can place our hand up close to the knee, or we can place our hand further away from the knee down by the ankle. Try both of those on someone, and which one's easier? Which one's harder for the patient to do, and which one's harder for you? And which one's easier for the patient to do, and which one's easier for you? And here's the terminology that's related to torque. And then just a quick summary. Torque is the amount of force needed by the muscle contraction to cause rotary joint motion. The greater the moment arm, the greater the angular force or torque. At 90 degrees, the torque potential is the greatest. Think about that bicep. If it's extended, if your elbow is extended all the way and your arm is straight, might be a little harder to carry that box out in front of you versus bending the elbow and using that bicep muscle. As a muscle contracts through its range of motion, the amount of angular, tensile, or stabilizing force will change. Okay, so let's go on to stability and center of gravity. Center of gravity, this is the balance point of an object at which weight on all sides is equal. It's the point at which the planes of the body intersect. The body's center of gravity when standing is located anterior to the second sacral vertebrae. Make sure you know that. So if you are taking a look at this picture and you see how the patient is divided into 4 quadrants, all right? They're divided up into these quadrants equally, and the actual center of gravity is at that anterior to the second sacral vertebrae level, which means this person's body weight is equally distributed. The base of support, this is the part of body that is in contact with the supporting surface. If you were just standing, it's not just the outline of the 2 feet. It is the entire area from the outside of the feet around. It doesn't go into the middle. It's all the way around. This is considered your base of support right here. So if I were to be standing on one leg, it would truly be just the outline of one foot. Make sure that you review the following terms in your book. You'll need to be able to identify definitions for them, and you'll also have to use them in scenarios. So line of gravity, this is the imaginary vertical line passing through the center of gravity toward the center of Earth. Goes all the way down. So wherever your center of gravity is, and this can change. If you move your body weight over to the left and you're only on one foot, this center of gravity is going to move over. The line of gravity is what falls through that center of gravity. Relationship of the line of gravity and base of support. So if the line of gravity is centered over the base of support, the patient is more stable. So of course, we're more stable in this position. If the line of gravity moves toward the edge of the base of support, the patient is less stable. So take a look at how this patient is shifting their weight. They still have foot contact on the other side right here, but just barely. But that's still, it doesn't change, but just a little bit here. However, because this line goes straight down to the center of the earth, it's barely hanging on within that base of support. So you have to be careful. What do you think is going to happen to the line of gravity if she keeps sliding over or shifting over her top weight? The line of gravity is going to fall off of the base of support. The wider the base of support, the more stable. A wider base of support in the direction of the force results in greater stability. So right here you've got a person who's fighting wind or fighting an outside force. And what have they done with their feet? Do we just stand with our feet together to fight an outside force? No. We actually will our bodies tend to want to stay stable, and so what we end up doing, or what this person is doing, is getting in more of a diagonal stance and bringing their feet further apart in order to keep from falling over and to keep their base of support and line of gravity within the base of support. So how does walking with crutches on only one leg change the line of gravity and base of support. You've got a definite change in the base of support. They've picked up this leg because maybe they're non-weight bearing, so you only have one foot. But what we've done is we've added 2 more points to the ground, and it's created a triangular base of support. Okay? So the crutches will increase the patient's base of support here. The line of gravity will fall in the center of the patient's base of support. Keep in mind the crutches do become a part of the person because they are touching the surface. They're touching the ground and making contact, and they're still touching you. How does carrying a suitcase change the line of gravity here? What's happening to that patient or to their body mechanics and their positioning? So since the suitcase is outside the base of support, the patient will lean their upper body to the opposite side of the suitcase to try to center the line of gravity over the base of support. You'll see that with students who carry heavy backpacks on one side. They don't lean into the weight of the backpack. They will lean away from the weight of the backpack. So carrying the suitcase results in the line of gravity moving to the left of the base of support in this scenario, but it still remains within the base of support. Okay, it's just they're shifting more of their body weight this way. It doesn't necessarily go up quite so high, the center of gravity, but it does, the entire thing will shift and move because you're adding weight to the body. A couple of principles that we need to discuss when we go through base of support and balance and everything else. Principle 1, balance, stability, and motion. The lower the center of gravity, the more stable the object. So if you were to think about that from the perspective of, let's see, how about a child and an adult? When you've got an adult, clearly they're taller. Their center of gravity moves up off of the ground. A child is a lot shorter, and so their center of gravity is going to be closer to the ground. So the more stable they're going to be. Let's take into consideration someone who's standing versus someone who's on their hands and knees crawling. Who's more stable? The person crawling, because their center of gravity is lower to the ground. So where's the center of gravity on each of these people? What's the difference? Who's more stable here? It's going to be the young lady, okay, because she is closer to the ground. Her center of gravity is closer to the ground. Principle 2, the center of gravity and line of gravity must remain within the base of support for an object to remain stable. So we talked about that with the girl who shifted all of her weight to the left side. Even though she was still on her tippy toes, what if she would take that right foot off and keep leaning towards the left? Eventually, this is going to happen. The line of gravity will move off of that base of support. Okay, the more, in this case, the more you move that book over, the center of gravity, or the center of this book weight, is going to go off of its base of support. Principle 3, stability increases as the base of support is widened in the direction of the force. Example, again, standing outside on a windy day. Stand facing into the wind, placing one foot behind the other, or at a diagonal, I should say, and then several inches apart. That's going to widen your base of support. And the greater the mass of the object, the greater the stability. Linebackers versus running backs. Think about that example in football. You've got linebackers who are shorter, bigger around. They've got a better base of support, so they're built for stability. And then, of course, you've got the running backs who typically are lighter on their feet. They move around quicker. They don't have as much mass, so they can move around quicker. The difference between the two, though, these running backs will be easier to push over because their mass is not as great, so they're not as stable. You've got the linebackers who their purpose is blocking, so they're more stable. Also take a look or think about the bottom of a pyramid in cheerleading. Who's more stable, or who do we typically put at the bottom of the pyramid? That would be those that are stronger or have greater mass for the ability of stability and balance. And principle 5, the greater the friction between the supporting surface and the base of supports, the more stable the body will be. We can use 100% the example of a patient. If we are getting them up, let's say they are in the hospital and all they have are socks on their feet. Well, we've got a hospital that typically will have tile in probably 99.9% of the cases. And so when socks hit tile, what happens? Is there friction? Not as much as if you were to put shoes on your patient. So make sure that in order to keep that base of support and keep it stable, you've got to establish friction, and so shoes will provide that the best amount of friction. You can use socks with the little gripper pads on the bottom. They don't work as well as shoes, but they will work because it creates friction and keeps the patient more stable. People have a better balance while moving if they focus on a stationary object rather than a moving object. Example would be crutches and walking. If you had crutches and you're looking down at those crutches moving, if you've ever had crutches, you might know what I'm talking about. You don't feel as stable. You're a little more wobbly because you're looking at a moving object while you're trying to move. If you focus on what's ahead, and that's what we direct our patients to do when they are walking with an assistive device or just walking, we want them to focus on something stationary ahead. And what this does is create a better sense of balance for the patient. And last little section here, terminology related to levers. You've got the lever, axis, force, resistance, force arm, and resistance arm. Make sure that you read this chapter in your book, this section. I encourage everyone to read the full chapters, but if you're skimming and going through, re-highlight this area. These are really important to understand because we talk about levers in the sense of human anatomy and the amount of force or the amount of resistance that's created. Force is usually what will cause the lever to move, usually a muscle, but not always. Resistance is what has to overcome the force or overcome the muscle. So if you're talking about the person we talked about earlier who was sitting in a chair and their knees were bent and they were going to kick their leg out, the muscle that's working here to extend that knee is the force, and maybe I am applying my own pressure or resistance to keep them from moving that leg. So there's 3 classes of levers. You've got a first class, a second class, and third class lever. Make sure you know those. You're going to have to identify that on quizzes or exams. Each has a different purpose and a different mechanical advantage. So we're going to look at, here's a diagram of the components of a lever. So the first class lever is designed for balance. Make sure you know that. Axis between the force and the resistance. So an example would be a teeter-totter or a seesaw. In human anatomy, an example would be the head sitting on the cervical vertebrae number 1 or C1. The axis is the actual vertebrae. The resistance is the weight of the head. And the force is, remember, usually it's the muscle. So the force is the muscle on the opposite side. If we didn't have, let's say, this muscle here, if it was weak, what would happen? It would not be balanced. The resistance or the weight of the head would force us to droop our head forward. How many forward heads do we see out there? Quite a bit. Second class lever designed for power. The axis is opposite of the force and resistance is what's in the middle. So an example might be a wheelbarrow up here. Because this is designed for power, the action of the plantar flexors when you're on your tiptoes may be an example. It can be debatable, but in this case, the axis is the toes, the toe joints, the metatarsal phalangeal joints in the foot here. The resistance is the tibia and the body weight from above, okay, so here in the front. And then the force, or the muscles that are trying to keep everything intact and provide power to the body, would be the plantar flexors, or the gastrocnemius in this case. Third class lever designed for motion. Let's see, axis is opposite of the resistance and the force is in the middle. It's designed for range of motion when it comes to the human body. A great example would be the elbow joint. So you have your axis here at the elbow. The resistance would be whatever's in the hand or the hand itself, okay? If you were to, let's say, hold a weight in that hand, you could do that, but in this case, the hand is just fine as the resistance. The force would be the biceps muscle, which attaches to the proximal radius. In this case, because it's designed for motion, what we are trying to accomplish is a range here, okay, or a movement. So third class lever is designed for movement. Mechanical advantage. If you can keep this in mind, it will help. It's when the force arm is greater than the resistance arm, okay? It's the relationship between the two. Mechanical advantage of a lever is determined by dividing the length of the force arm by the length of the resistance arm. So as long as you come out with a positive number, you have a mechanical advantage. Think about the fraction 4/2, okay? As long as you come out with 2 as the answer, that's a positive number. If it were 1/2, that's 1/2, 0.5. So you're not above the 1 mark, and so what you're seeing is not a mechanical advantage there. This is that same scenario we've been talking about. What type of lever, first of all, is in the above scenario? What's the advantage of this type of lever? And which scenario requires the PTA, or physical therapist assistant, to apply more force to cause the patient's knee to bend if the patient is trying to keep it from bending? So this would be the opposite of what we were talking about. If we had that patient extend their knee, try to keep it straight, and we were trying to push down on it, what's happening? So I'll give you guys just a second to look over these answers. Go ahead and pause it if you need to. Don't look at the next slide. Okay, so what type of lever is the above scenario? In this example, the patient is trying to keep the knee extended straight by resisting the outside force, which would mean that it's power, the type of lever. And which number is that? I'm going to let you guys answer that one as far as 1, 2, or 3. The axis is the knee. The resistance is going to be, let's see, the knee extensor muscles, and the force is the pushing down from the PT or PTA. Of course, it's a second class lever. And when we say that the resistance is the knee extensor muscles, typically it would be, let's say, the the person or the outside, I would normally call it force, but the resistance in this case is going to be the extensor muscles that are trying to overcome the force. The force is what is causing the knee joint to move. So, which would be the PTA's hand trying to push it down. Okay, so mechanical advantage. As the lifting carrying application, which one of these takes less energy? And we talked about that earlier, just in another type of scenario, but if you stop and think about it, if you're holding a box, do we typically hold a box 2 inches away from us naturally or 10 inches away from us? What is going to create a mechanical advantage here? All right, so if she shortens the resistance arm and brings her elbows in, she gives herself that mechanical advantage, okay, over the lengthening the arms. Takes more energy to hold the box further away from the body. What's the difference between placing a cuff weight at a patient's ankle and placing it closer to the knee in the instance of straight leg raises? The patient's muscle will have to work harder or generate more force with the weight at the patient's ankle. Is it easier to stand up when leaning forward or maintaining an upright sitting posture? Why? So here we're going to backtrack and talk about line of gravity and base of support. It's easier to stand up if you can lean forward because the line of gravity is moving forward, resulting in less weight on the patient's bottom. Therefore, the patient's legs don't have to be as strong to bring them to a standing position. So try that. Try to stand up without leaning forward from your chair, and then try to stand up leaning forward, and you decide which is easier. So changing the length of the force arm or resistance arm will make the movement easier or harder. Okay, this is the last section, pulleys. A grooved wheel that turns on an axle with a rope or cable riding in the groove. The purpose is to change the direction of a force or increase or decrease the magnitude of the force. Go through this in your book as well. Make sure you read some of the examples here. I'm just going to quickly touch on a few things, but I want you all to really look in detail in your book. We don't typically test on a lot of this part of the information. It's more about determining these levers. So you've got, let's see, a fixed pulley and then a simple pulley attached to a beam. This acts as a first class lever. Force is on one side, resistance is on the other, and it's used to change direction but try to keep it balanced. An example anatomically would be the lateral malleolus of the fibula, or that outside ankle bone, which acts as a pulley for the peroneus longus tendon. It changes its direction of pull to try to balance. And then here, another type of anatomical pulley is the example of the patella. This will protrude to act as a pulley, the patella bone, their kneecap. It brings a gap close between the femur and the tibia. The direction of the pull will change a little bit here, but it's also to help create a mechanical advantage. If you didn't have that patella to allow the muscle to formulate over it or to form over it, you're not going to have much of a mechanical advantage here. Okay, and again, take time if you want to look over the textbook and lab manual. This is for students who are in class, and we typically do these while we're in class. Thank you very much.